So, Dr. Robert Boggs, professor in South Asian Studies, thank you very much for this interview. We will talk about Pakistan today. You gave a seminar not too long ago on the issue of Pakistan. My first question is, what is a failed state, number one? And is Pakistan on its way to be a failed state?
Good questions. The whole concept of failed state is one that's fraught with problems, conceptual problems. As you know, it's a concept that a lot of people use. You see it in the newspapers and so forth. But realistically, there isn't a consensus on what it means. The traditional definition is that a state has failed when it loses the monopoly on the use of legitimate force within the boundaries of the nation state. That's happened in places like perhaps Somalia, a rather extreme case. But in many ways, other people have written about the concept and have pointed out that if the leadership of a state loses the, not just say popularity, but loses its legitimacy in the eyes of the population, that could be considered one index of failing. And then I think perhaps a more modern idea is that if the state fails to provide the basic social services, public health, education, and security that most people now associate with a modern state, then that state is failing. I would argue that many states fail in one way or another. And in fact, I would say perhaps all states fail against a kind of a model of what a modern nation state should be, including, by the way, in some respects, the United States. I talked about Pakistan recently because the record of success or failure of Pakistan is so important on the world scene these days. As you know, Pakistan is a strategically important country on a whole series of measures. It has in excess of 180 million people, making it probably the 6th largest country on earth. It's also the 2nd largest country in terms of having a Muslim population. Some people say its armed forces are, at least in size, are the 7th largest. And it's reported by some people that it has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal on the planet, which of course poses certain issues.
Sorry, by growing, you mean they're adding warheads?
That's the belief. Adding fissile material, warheads, and I think that's fairly obvious. They're testing missiles, so that also delivery systems as well. So it's, in fact, some people have said, and there's a lot of guesstimation in this, that Pakistan, if it continues its current trajectory of nuclear development, would supplant France as the 5th largest, as the country with the 5th largest nuclear arsenal.
How many warheads are we talking about here, more or less?
Well, again, this is all in open sources.
Yeah.
Something between 90 and 110 warheads. So that's.
We're talking mostly strategic or tactical?
That's the tactical issue is a whole new one. We could discuss that if you like, but no, we're talking about strategic basically. Right. That the length, the range, and the capacity of some of its missiles could easily put a nuclear weapon on a number of India's major cities, for example. Anyway, to get back to the subject, there is real concern in many parts of the United States, and I think the West in general, about the situation in Pakistan. It is clearly, to answer your question, it's clearly failing in a number of ways. If we go back to that earlier definition of the state having a monopoly on the exercise of legitimate force, well, that's actually, there are parts of Pakistan that Pakistani generals themselves call no-go areas. Those are areas in which the organs of Pakistani government do not operate because they're controlled by militant groups, often violent militant groups. These are parts of the country where civil servants and other figures of authority are routinely murdered. They are parts of the country in which even the Pakistani armed forces, with all their power, do not go except in fairly large formations. So I would say that in an area called the Fatah, the frontier area next to Afghanistan, already the Pakistani state has failed to maintain its sovereignty. But in other respects too, and remember, I'm not criticizing Pakistan, I'm just pointing out trends that raise some question marks about Pakistan's future, and by extension, the future and the security of that whole region. If you look at opinion polls in Pakistan, it's clear that many of Pakistan's political institutions are not held in high esteem by the Pakistani population. If you look back over the decades since Pakistan's establishment, the state has not done very well, even by regional standards, in delivering public services. The educational system is in many ways appallingly underdeveloped. Levels of literacy are still low for a country that is a modern state. Public health is bad. In fact, there are certain diseases that have almost been eradicated in the world, like tuberculosis, except for Pakistan, and in particularly those areas where I mentioned that the state's writ doesn't really extend. There are all kinds of ways in which, well, right now, the state has been unable to provide the electric power, either electricity or gas, that a modern state in a modern economy requires, so that the poor Pakistani population suffers from periods of electricity blackout. In the winter, they don't have enough gas. Industry doesn't have enough energy. So as a consequence, not only is Pakistan's rate of development adversely affected, but you find that actually industrial production suffers. And there has been, as a result, as you can expect, there has been a flight of capital, a flight of talent, because people just don't have the economic opportunities that they should have. And there's been a dwindling for Pakistan, either from an administrative infrastructure point of view or from an energy point of view, as being a place that's a good place to invest. When it was first created in 1947, Pakistan had a well-developed rail system, and arguably the most developed system of irrigation, of groundwater irrigation, surface water irrigation on the planet. It was, and a lot of the agricultural production of Pakistan was dependent on that. Well, both the rail system and the irrigation system have not been maintained. There has not been investment in it, and both of them are really failing. So this is just another way in which I would say that yes, Pakistan is failing. Will it ever be a failed state? Well, I don't know, but a major factor in whether it actually fails, it fails in a catastrophic way, would depend on whether or not the forces of law enforcement and the armed forces, the military, can turn the tide on a trend of domestic violence that's sweeping the country. These may not be exactly right, but something like between 2003 and today, more than 51,000 Pakistanis have died from violence. You can call it terror, you can call it extremism or separatism, but it's domestic violence. More than 18,000 innocent civilians have died in that violence, over 20,000 of the armed forces. This violence could, if it is not contained, and I would argue if it's not rolled back, the very existence of Pakistan's constitutional order will be in jeopardy. And if that happens, then the ripple effects could be really quite severe.
And what will be the consequences of a failed Pakistan for the region, especially in relation to India, Afghanistan, but also for the rest of the world? What are the worries from an American perspective of a potentially failed Pakistan?
Well, remember what I said. It's a large population, large military establishment, nuclear weapons, but and I think there's no real debate about this. It is clear that the same folks who are killing Pakistanis, the same ideologically driven forces, extremist forces, have also been responsible for carrying out terror attacks inside India and creating or perpetuating a very tense relationship with Pakistan's large neighbor to the east, India. So that's a problem. And keep in mind that India too has nuclear weapons. So it is not inconceivable in my mind that not right away, but in some future date, terrorists, they could be non-state actors, they could be rogue actors, ones over which the government of Pakistan has no control, would carry out another terrorist outrage in India, and that the Indian government would feel constrained politically to react militarily, and there could be a situation of escalating violence between India and Pakistan that, in the worst case, could end up with a nuclear exchange between the two of them. The consequences of such an exchange, given the populations of the two countries, is too horrible even to contemplate. At the same time, it is quite clear, I mean, I think the intelligence is there, that groups that persons are indoctrinated and trained and sent from Pakistan across the border westward into Afghanistan. And these groups, for years now, again, based in Pakistan, trained in Pakistan, finding sanctuary in Pakistan, have attacked the Afghan army, Afghan civilians, and the ISAF, the international ISAF forces there as well. I would argue that once foreign forces leave, or at least most foreign forces leave Afghanistan at the end of this year, 2014, that Pakistan's prospects for remaining stable, prosperous, are going to be greatly diminished if the Pakistani authorities cannot get control over these groups that are moving back and forth across the border. So again, the whole future of Afghanistan could be jeopardized by cross-border militancy. And think of it this way: if these militants, which have been bred many ways in Pakistan, gain control of swaths of Afghan territory, as they did before 2001, those areas could be used again as staging grounds for international terrorism. These days, with electronics and electronic financial transfers being what they are, a group could be operating out of the mountains along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border and could launch attacks worldwide. You recall, for example, that a young Pakistan-born American in 2010 tried to ignite a bomb in Times Square in New York. He was trained in militant camps in Pakistan. And that sort of thing, by individuals or small numbers of people, could happen again. So literally, if the Pakistani government does not reassert its authority, its control over all parts of its territory, and does not stop this export of violence, the consequences are literally global.